Most people looked at the mattress and saw junk. The billionaire looked at the woman carrying it and saw a story he would never forget. The rain had started just before sunset, turning the streets of downtown Chicago into a blur of red brake lights and shimmering reflections. People hurried along the sidewalks with umbrellas tilted against the wind, their eyes fixed on destinations, schedules, and screens. Nobody paid much attention to the young woman struggling across the intersection. Nobody except Alexander Hayes. From the back seat of a black Bentley, Alexander glanced away from the stack of acquisition documents resting on his lap. At 41, he had spent most of his life looking ahead. The next deal, the next expansion, the next tower with his company's name stamped across the skyline. But something outside the tinted window caught his attention. A woman was dragging a twin mattress through the rain, not carrying it with help, not loading it into a truck, dragging it alone. The mattress was wrapped in cloudy plastic that had torn open along one side. Water soaked through the exposed fabric. One corner scraped against the pavement every few feet, leaving a dark trail behind. The woman paused at the curb, breathing hard. She couldn't have been older than 28. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail that the wind kept tearing apart. Her jacket looked too thin for the weather. Her sneakers were soaked. Yet she kept moving. Alexander watched as traffic surged around her. People stared. A few drivers honked impatiently when she slowed their turn. Nobody got out to help. Nobody even rolled down a window. Then she stumbled. One wheel of a delivery cart struck a crack in the sidewalk. The mattress shifted and nearly toppled over. She caught it at the last second. Alexander expected frustration, anger, tears. Instead, she simply adjusted her grip and kept going. Something about that unsettled him. "Sir?" his assistant asked from the front passenger seat. "We're already running behind." Alexander didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the woman. Then he noticed something written across the side of the mattress. Large blue letters. Childish handwriting. The plastic had peeled back just enough for the words to show. Noah's bed. Alexander frowned. Not Noah's mattress. Not property of Noah. Noah's bed. The words looked personal. Important. Like something a child had written to claim the one thing that belonged to him. The traffic light changed. The Bentley rolled forward. Yet Alexander found himself twisting in his seat to keep watching. The woman crossed the next block. The mattress swayed dangerously in the wind. She stopped beneath a flickering street lamp and pulled a small photograph from her pocket. For a moment she stared at it. Then she tucked it away and continued walking. "Who is she?" Alexander murmured. Of course nobody knew. To the city, she was invisible. Just another struggling single mother trying to survive another week. His phone vibrated. A reminder appeared on the screen. $47 million land acquisition. Final signing in 30 minutes. Normally nothing would have distracted him from a deal of that size. Tonight, he barely looked at it. The woman turned onto a side street. Alexander's gaze followed her until she disappeared behind a row of aging brick buildings. Then, without fully understanding why, he closed the acquisition folder. "Change of plans," he said. His assistant turned around. "Sir." Alexander reached for the door handle. "I want to know where she's going." Neither man knew that within the next hour, one exhausted single mother, one rain-soaked mattress, and one frightened little boy named Noah would force a billionaire to confront a truth that no boardroom, no fortune, and no skyscraper had ever taught him. The rain intensified as Alexander stepped onto the sidewalk. Cold drops struck the shoulders of his tailored coat almost immediately, but he barely noticed. Behind him, his assistant hurried out of the car. "Sir, the signing begins in less than 30 minutes. Alexander glanced toward the corner where the woman had disappeared. "Reschedule it." The assistant stared at him in disbelief. "Reschedule a $47 million acquisition." "Yes." Alexander started walking. "Tell them something came up." During his 20 years in business, nobody had ever heard those words from him. Deals came first. Meetings came first. Growth came first. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he found himself moving through the rain after a stranger carrying a mattress. The side street grew quieter with every block. Luxury storefronts gave way to aging brick buildings. The sidewalks narrowed. Streetlights became less frequent. Alexander spotted her nearly half a block ahead. Emily Carter. He did not know her name yet, but he noticed how determined she looked despite obvious exhaustion. Every few yards, she stopped to catch her breath before forcing herself forward again. The mattress seemed almost as large as she was. A gust of wind pushed against it like a sail. She tightened her grip and kept moving. Then something unexpected happened. A city bus rolled past, splashing water onto the sidewalk. The mattress slipped from her hands and landed heavily against a chain-link fence. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Not in anger, not in frustration, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. Alexander crossed the street before he could second-guess himself. "Need a hand?" he asked. Emily turned sharply. Surprise flashed across her face. She looked him up and down, taking in the expensive coat, polished shoes, and unmistakable confidence of someone who had never worried about rent. "I am fine," she said quickly. "Thank you." Her voice was polite but guarded. Alexander nodded toward the mattress. "That does not look fine." For a second, he thought she might laugh. Instead, she adjusted the torn plastic and reached for the handle again. "I have carried worse." The answer caught him off guard. Most people would have complained. Most would have welcomed help. Emily simply stated it as a fact. She had carried worse. Alexander stepped beside her. "At least let me help move it." "Why?" The question came instantly. Not rude. Not suspicious. Just honest. Why would a stranger help? Alexander realized he did not have a good answer. "Because it is raining." Emily studied him for another moment before reluctantly releasing one side. Together, they lifted the mattress. It became easier immediately, lighter, more balanced. They walked in silence for nearly a block. Then Alexander noticed she kept glancing toward an old photograph tucked inside her jacket pocket. Finally, he asked, "Someone important?" Emily looked down at the pocket. A faint smile appeared. The first smile he had seen. "My son, Noah." She stopped walking. Her eyes widened. Alexander pointed toward the writing on the mattress. Noah's bed. The tension in her shoulders softened slightly. "He wrote that 2 years ago." Her voice grew quieter. He was proud because it was the first bed that belonged only to him. Alexander looked at the worn mattress differently now. It was not furniture. It was a piece of a child's world. A small island of stability. They continued another block before Alexander finally asked the question that had been bothering him since he left the car. "Where exactly are we taking this?" Emily stared ahead at the darkening street. The smile disappeared. "To the only place they have not locked yet." Something in the way she said it made Alexander's stomach tighten. A few minutes later, they rounded the next corner. And what he saw there made him stop walking. Beyond the corner stood a warehouse that looked forgotten by the rest of the city. Its brick walls were stained by decades of weather. Several windows had been boarded up with mismatched sheets of plywood. A rusted metal sign hung crooked above a loading dock that had not seen a truck in years. The place should have been empty. Instead, faint light glowed from one of the side entrances. Emily continued forward without hesitation. Alexander followed, carrying his side of the mattress in silence. As they approached the open doorway, voices drifted into the rainy evening. A child laughed. Someone was heating water on a portable stove. Somewhere deeper inside, a radio played soft country music through a blanket of static. Alexander slowed. He had expected a shelter, maybe a church basement. What he found was something entirely different. Inside the warehouse, nearly 24 people had created a fragile community among rows of old storage spaces. Blankets hung from ropes to create makeshift rooms. Folding chairs surrounded small tables. Plastic bins held clothing, books, and personal belongings. Children colored pictures under battery-powered lanterns while adults quietly prepared dinner. Nobody looked dangerous. Nobody looked lazy. They looked tired. They looked like people who had simply run out of places to go. Emily guided the mattress toward a corner near the back wall. The moment she entered, a small boy jumped up from a folding chair. "Mom," he shouted. He raced across the concrete floor and wrapped his arms around her waist. Emily dropped to one knee and hugged him tightly. Every trace of exhaustion disappeared from her face. "Hey, buddy. You got it back." Noah's eyes locked onto the mattress. Relief flooded his expression. "I told you I would." Alexander watched quietly. Noah could not have been older than 6. His blonde hair stuck out in every direction. His oversized sweatshirt hung almost to his knees. Yet his smile transformed the entire room. The boy rushed over to the mattress and placed both hands on it, as if greeting an old friend. "I was worried somebody would take it." Emily brushed rainwater from his forehead. "Nobody is taking your bed." The simple exchange hit Alexander harder than he expected. He had spent millions furnishing penthouses and executive suites. Yet this child valued one worn mattress more than some people valued entire houses. An older woman approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You found help this time," she said with a gentle smile. Emily accepted 1 cup, only because he happened to be walking by. The woman nodded politely toward Alexander. "Thank you. We look out for each other here." Alexander glanced around again. "How long have people been staying here?" The woman exchanged a look with Emily. "Depends on who you ask." "A few weeks," Emily answered carefully. "Some longer. Why here?" Emily hesitated. Noah sat on the mattress, happily smoothing out the blanket spread across it. Finally she spoke. "Because every other door closed." Before Alexander could respond, a loud rumble echoed from outside. Thunder rolled across the city skyline. Several children instinctively moved closer to their parents. Emily tucked Noah's blanket around the mattress and smiled reassuringly at him. Then Alexander noticed something on the far wall. A large notice had been taped beside the entrance. Rain had smeared some of the ink, but the company logo remained clear. Hayes Urban Development Group. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He stepped closer. The notice referenced property acquisition, redevelopment schedules, and upcoming site preparation. The date was only 3 weeks away. Suddenly the warehouse, the families, and the mattress snapped together into a single terrible picture. This building sat on land his company had recently purchased. Emily followed his gaze toward the notice. "Funny, right?" she said quietly. "The company that bought this place also bought our apartment building." Alexander stared at the logo bearing his own name. "What happened?" Emily looked down at Noah before answering. "We were told the building was being redeveloped. Rent doubled. Then came the notices. Most families left. Some could not." Her voice remained calm, but the sadness underneath it was impossible to miss. "We tried to keep up. I worked every extra shift I could find. It still was not enough." For the first time that evening, Alexander felt something unfamiliar. Not sympathy, not curiosity, guilt. The warehouse suddenly felt smaller. The conversations around him faded into the background. The laughter of children, the hiss of a portable kettle, the soft hum of the old radio. Alexander could hear all of it, yet his attention remained fixed on the company logo staring back at him from the notice taped to the wall. He had seen that logo thousands of times. On annual reports, on office towers, on construction sites across the country. It had always represented success, growth, progress. Tonight it represented something else. Emily seemed unaware of the storm unfolding inside his mind. She knelt beside Noah and helped him spread a faded blue blanket across the mattress. The boy immediately climbed onto it and bounced once before stopping himself. "Sorry," he said with a grin. "I forgot." Emily laughed softly. "What did we say about indoor trampolines?" "No jumping." "Exactly." Noah settled down cross-legged and opened a worn paperback book from his backpack. The scene looked so ordinary that it hurt. A mother helping her son get comfortable for the night. A child reading before bed. The kind of moment millions of families experienced every evening without a second thought. Yet here it was happening inside an abandoned warehouse. Alexander found himself staring at the mattress again. Not because of what it was, because of what it represented. The last piece of normal life a little boy still had. "How old is he?" Alexander asked quietly. 6. Emily adjusted the blanket. "He turns 7 in November. He seems like a good kid." A smile touched her face. "He is." For a moment, she looked at Noah the way only a parent could, like she was seeing every version of him at once. The baby he had been, the boy he was becoming, the future she was desperately trying to protect. "He makes all of this easier," she said. "And harder." Alexander understood exactly what she meant, even though he had never been a parent. Love gave people strength. Love also gave them something to lose. An older man carrying a toolbox approached from across the warehouse. Gray-haired and thin, he nodded politely toward Alexander. "New volunteer?" Emily hesitated. "Not exactly." The man extended a hand anyway. "Frank Turner." Alexander shook it. "Alexander." Frank smiled. "Well, Alexander, if you are helping people move furniture in this weather, you are already ahead of most folks." Several nearby adults chuckled. The warmth surprised him. Nobody here seemed bitter. They had every reason to be. Yet they shared food, blankets, and jokes with one another. They had built a community from almost nothing. Frank glanced toward the notice on the wall. "Funny thing about those redevelopment projects. His tone remained calm. People always talk about new buildings. Nobody talks much about the people already living there. Emily lowered her eyes. Frank immediately seemed to regret saying it. Sorry. Long day. No, Emily said gently. You are right. The older man nodded and moved away. Alexander remained silent. Every word landed harder than the last. His phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. He stepped aside and looked at the screen. 12 missed calls. 7 text messages. 3 emails marked urgent. The acquisition meeting had clearly descended into chaos without him. Normally, that would have bothered him. Tonight, it felt strangely unimportant. Another message arrived from his assistant. The board is asking where you are. Investors are waiting. Alexander stared at the words before locking the screen. Across the room, Noah suddenly looked up from his book. Mom. Yeah, buddy. Are we staying here tomorrow too? The question seemed innocent enough. Emily froze. Just for a second. Then she forced a smile. We will figure tomorrow out tomorrow. Noah nodded, satisfied by the answer. Children had a remarkable ability to trust. He returned to his book. But Alexander noticed what Emily did not say. She had not promised they would be leaving. She had not promised a better place. She had only promised to keep trying. And somehow that felt far more heartbreaking. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the warehouse windows. Inside, families prepared for another night in a place never meant to be home. And for the first time in many years, Alexander Hayes found himself wondering whether success meant something entirely different than he had always believed. The evening stretched deeper into night. One by one, portable lanterns flickered on across the warehouse, casting warm circles of light against the old brick walls. Someone handed out bowls of soup. A young mother tucked her daughter beneath a blanket. An elderly couple played a quiet game of cards on an overturned storage crate. The warehouse was still cold, still temporary, still uncertain. Yet there was a strange dignity in the way everyone carried themselves. Nobody begged. Nobody complained. They simply adapted. Alexander stood near one of the windows, watching rain streak down the glass. For years he had believed he understood hardship. He had built his company from nothing. He had worked endless hours. He had sacrificed relationships and sleep and nearly every hobby he once loved. But standing here, he realized there was a difference between struggle and vulnerability. He had always had options. These families did not. Emily approached carrying 2 paper cups. Coffee, she asked. Alexander accepted one. Thank you. It is not exactly gourmet. Right now it smells better than anything I have had all week. That earned a small laugh. They stood quietly for a moment. Across the room, Noah was helping another child arrange books on a folding table. The seriousness with which he performed the task made him look older than 6. He likes helping, Emily said, following Alexander's gaze. Makes him feel useful. He seems happy. Emily smiled sadly. Children are resilient. Sometimes more than they should have to be. Alexander looked down at the coffee. You said you worked extra shifts. 3 jobs at one point. 3. Waitress. Grocery store inventory. Cleaning offices downtown on weekends. She shrugged as though it were nothing unusual. I only sleep about 5 hours most nights. Alexander found himself struggling to imagine it. And still it was not enough? Emily shook her head. Not after the rent increase. She stared into her cup. The apartment was tiny. 600 square feet. The plumbing barely worked. The heat broke every winter. But it was ours. Her voice softened. Noah learned to ride a bike in the parking lot. We celebrated every birthday there. I thought if I kept working hard enough, eventually things would get better. Alexander felt every word land heavier than the last. What happened after the notices? Emily took a slow breath. Some families left immediately. Some moved in with relatives. I did not have that option. She glanced toward Noah. His father left when he was a baby. My parents passed away years ago. It was just us. The warehouse noise seemed to fade again. Alexander had read countless reports about housing displacement, redevelopment timelines, and economic projections. They were always numbers, percentages, statistics. Nobody ever included stories about little boys writing their names on mattresses. Nobody included the mothers working 3 jobs to keep a 600-square-foot apartment. Suddenly Noah appeared beside them. Mom, look. He held up a drawing. Emily smiled immediately. Let me see. The picture showed a small house beneath a bright yellow sun. A woman stood beside a boy. A dog occupied one corner, even though they did not own a dog. "And who is this?" Emily asked. Noah pointed proudly at the drawing. "That is our future dog." Emily laughed. "Of course it is." Then Noah pointed at the house. "And that is where we are going to live someday." The confidence in his voice was absolute. Complete faith. Complete trust. Emily's smile remained in place, but Alexander noticed her eyes glisten briefly before she blinked it away. Noah returned to the other children. Neither adult spoke for several seconds. Finally, Emily whispered, almost to herself, "I hope I can give him that someday." Alexander watched the drawing disappear across the room. A simple house. A simple dream. Yet somehow it felt more valuable than every skyscraper he had ever built. And for the first time that night, a decision began forming in his mind. Not as a businessman, not as a CEO, as a human being. Later that night, after most of the children had fallen asleep, the warehouse grew quiet. The rain softened into a gentle patter against the roof, and the lanterns cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Noah was already asleep on his mattress, one arm wrapped around his book as if he were afraid it might disappear by morning. Emily carefully pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders before standing. When she turned, she found Alexander still awake near the window. "You should probably get home," she said with a tired smile. "People with important jobs usually do not spend their evenings in places like this." Alexander looked around the warehouse. "Maybe they should." Emily laughed softly. "That sounds nice, but the world does not work that way." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander asked a question that had been sitting in the back of his mind all evening. "What did you do before all this?" Emily folded her arms against the chill. "Administrative assistant. Small logistics company." "You liked it?" "I loved it." The answer came immediately. "I like solving problems, organizing things, making impossible schedules somehow work." A faint smile crossed her face. "My boss used to joke that I could keep a hurricane on schedule." Alexander found himself smiling too. "And after the layoffs? I took whatever work I could find." She shrugged. "When you have a child depending on you, pride becomes a luxury." The honesty in her voice struck him. There was no bitterness, no self-pity, just truth. Across the room, a few parents quietly prepared sleeping areas for the night. One man repaired a broken folding chair with surprising care. Another woman shared a blanket with an elderly neighbor. Everyone seemed focused on helping someone else despite having so little themselves. Alexander had spent years sitting in boardrooms discussing efficiency, productivity, and profit margins. Yet this room contained something his company had never managed to manufacture: community. His phone vibrated again. This time he answered. "Sir," his assistant said immediately. "The board is demanding an explanation." Alexander glanced around the warehouse before speaking. "Cancel tomorrow morning's acquisition review." Silence filled the line. "Sir, you heard me. The investors will not like that." Alexander watched Noah sleeping peacefully for the first time that day. "Then they will have to be disappointed." He ended the call before further arguments could begin. Emily looked at him curiously. "You must have a very understanding employer." The corner of Alexander's mouth lifted slightly. "Something like that." She shook her head. "Well, whoever they are lucky to have someone willing to help strangers carry mattresses through the rain." The words lingered between them. Alexander realized she still had no idea who he was. For the first time in years, that felt strangely refreshing. No expectations, no headlines, no reputation. Just one person speaking honestly to another. As midnight approached, Emily prepared a small sleeping area beside Noah's mattress. Alexander knew he should leave. Instead, he found himself looking once more at the notice on the wall carrying his company's logo. Earlier it had made him feel guilty. Now it made him determined. Somewhere inside the system he had built, something had gone terribly wrong. Families like Emily's had become collateral damage hidden behind spreadsheets and development plans. Tomorrow, he intended to find out exactly how it happened. And when he did, some very powerful people were going to discover that the man who signed the checks was no longer willing to look the other way. Alexander left the warehouse just before dawn. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a cold gray mist. His driver was waiting at the curb, but for once Alexander ignored the warm leather interior and stood motionless beside the car. Across the street, the warehouse looked smaller in daylight. Less dramatic, less visible. Thousands of people would pass by it without ever realizing dozens of families were trying to survive inside. Yet Alexander could not stop thinking about Noah's drawing. a small house, a bright sun, a future dog. Such ordinary dreams. Such impossible dreams for people who had done nothing wrong except fall behind in a city that kept moving faster. By 7 o'clock that morning, Alexander was sitting in the executive conference room on the top floor of Hayes Urban Development Group. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline. Fresh coffee sat untouched beside him. Around the table, senior executives exchanged nervous glances. Several had received urgent messages before sunrise ordering them to attend. Nobody knew why. Alexander opened a thick project file and slid it across the polished table. I want every document related to the South River redevelopment project. One executive frowned. Sir, the acquisition is already approved. That was not my question. The room fell silent. Another executive cleared his throat. Everything followed standard procedure. Alexander's expression remained calm. Then showing me the paperwork should be easy. For the next hour, stacks of reports filled the table. Relocation summaries, financial projections, legal notices, community impact assessments. The deeper Alexander read, the more disturbed he became. On paper, everything appeared compliant, technically correct, yet entire sections felt disconnected from reality. Families were described as occupancy units. Homes were listed as assets. Human beings had been reduced to numbers. Then he found something that made him stop. A recommendation from a regional director suggested extending relocation assistance by 90 days due to unusually high housing costs in the area. The recommendation had been rejected. Alexander looked up. Who denied this? Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Finally, one spoke. Martin Keller. Alexander remembered the name immediately. Senior Vice President. Ambitious. Efficient. Known for delivering projects ahead of schedule. Bring him in. 30 minutes later, Martin entered confidently carrying a tablet. His confidence faded the moment he saw the documents spread across the table. Sir. Alexander tapped the rejected recommendation. Why was this denied? Martin adjusted his tie. The extension would have delayed construction. By how long? Approximately 8 weeks. And the cost? Martin hesitated. Around $1.8 million. The room remained perfectly still. Alexander leaned back in his chair. So families lost housing because we wanted to save $1.8 million. Martin immediately shook his head. No, sir. Alternative resources were available. Alexander thought of Noah sleeping on a worn mattress inside a warehouse. He thought of Emily working 3 jobs. He thought of the drawing with the little house beneath the yellow sun. Were they? He asked quietly. Martin opened his mouth, but could not answer. For the first time, Alexander saw uncertainty replace confidence. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Somewhere along the way, people inside his company had stopped seeing communities and started seeing obstacles. And because he had been focused on profits and expansion, he had allowed it to happen. Alexander closed the file slowly. Effective immediately, all activity related to South River is suspended. Shock spread across the room. Several executives began protesting at once. Alexander raised one hand, and silence returned. This project is not moving forward until every displaced family has a legitimate place to go. Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its busy morning. Inside, careers, plans, and expectations shifted in an instant. But hundreds of blocks away, inside a forgotten warehouse, Emily and Noah still had no idea that the stranger who helped carry a mattress through the rain had just changed the future of their lives. 3 days later, the warehouse woke to something unusual. Hope. Nobody said it out loud at first. People were afraid to. Too many promises had come and gone. Too many officials had appeared with sympathetic smiles before disappearing again. Yet rumors traveled quickly through the rows of makeshift rooms. Construction activity had stopped. Eviction deadlines had been suspended. Meetings were being scheduled with housing coordinators. Frank was the first to bring the news to Emily. He hurried across the warehouse holding a folded newspaper. You need to see this. Emily looked up from helping Noah with a math worksheet. Frank spread the paper across a table. There, on the front page of the local business section, was a photograph of a familiar face. Emily stared at it. Her breath caught. The man from the rain. The stranger who had helped carry the mattress. The stranger who drank terrible warehouse coffee without complaining. Alexander Hayes, founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Urban Development Group. Emily read the headline twice before the words fully registered. Noah noticed her expression immediately. "Mom." She handed him the newspaper. His eyes widened. "That is him." Frank nodded. "Looks like your mattress-moving friend owns half the city." Emily felt her stomach twist. Suddenly dozens of small details made sense. The expensive coat, the phone calls, the confidence, the way people seemed to listen whenever he spoke. She remembered telling him exactly what his company had done to families like hers. She remembered criticizing the redevelopment project while standing beside the man responsible for it. Before she could process the revelation, several black SUVs pulled up outside the warehouse. Conversations stopped. Children moved closer to parents. Doors opened. Men and women carrying clipboards stepped out. A tense silence filled the building. Then Alexander appeared. He was dressed in a navy suit this time, looking every bit the executive from the newspaper photograph. Yet his expression remained exactly the same as it had been during the storm. Calm, respectful, human. Emily crossed her arms as he approached. "You forgot to mention a few things." A brief smile touched his face. "I suppose I did. You own the company." "Yes." "The company that bought our building." "Yes." He did not hide from the truth. He did not make excuses. That surprised her more than anything. The warehouse remained silent as dozens of eyes followed the conversation. Alexander looked around the room before speaking. "I owe every person here an apology." Nobody interrupted. What happened should never have happened. We made decisions based on numbers and schedules. We failed to see the people behind them. Frank exchanged a skeptical glance with another resident. Years of disappointment had taught them caution. Alexander seemed to understand. "You do not have to trust me today," he continued. "Trust is earned. But starting immediately, every family here will receive temporary housing assistance, relocation support, and access to permanent housing options. No one will be forced out without somewhere safe to go." The room remained quiet for several seconds. Then an elderly woman began to cry softly. Another resident lowered his head into his hands. A young mother hugged her daughter. The words sounded almost too good to believe. Noah tugged on Emily's sleeve. "Does that mean we get a home?" Emily looked at her son, then at Alexander. For the first time since opening the newspaper, she saw something beyond the suit, the title, and the wealth. She saw the same man who had stepped into the rain to help a stranger carry a mattress. And somehow, that mattered more than everything else. 6 weeks later, sunlight poured through the living room window of a small apartment on the north side of Chicago. It was not a luxury penthouse. It did not overlook the skyline. The kitchen was modest. The furniture did not match. But to Noah, it was perfect. He raced across the carpet wearing socks, nearly sliding into a bookshelf before catching himself at the last second. "Mom, look." Emily looked up from the dining table where she was reviewing paperwork. Noah pointed proudly toward the corner of the room. A dog bed sat beside the window, empty for now, but waiting. "You were still planning for that dog?" she asked. "Of course." Noah grinned. "A house is not complete without one." Emily laughed. It was a sound that had become more common lately. The dark circles beneath her eyes had faded. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased. For the first time in years, she was not calculating how to survive next week. She was thinking about next year. A knock sounded at the door. Noah rushed to answer it before she could stop him. Standing in the hallway was Alexander Hayes. No cameras, no assistants, no security detail. Just Alexander carrying a cardboard box. "Delivery," he announced. Noah immediately stepped aside. "Come in." Alexander entered and placed the box on the table. Inside were books, art supplies, and several framed photographs taken during the warehouse community relocation project. Many of the former residents had chosen to stay connected. Some had found apartments. Others had accepted jobs through new community programs funded by the redevelopment initiative. The warehouse itself had been transformed into a temporary resource center while permanent housing solutions were completed. Frank now worked there part-time, helping families navigate services. The elderly woman who cried that morning had moved closer to her grandchildren. Little by little, lives had begun moving forward again. Emily looked through the photographs quietly. "You really did it." Alexander shook his head. "We did it. Most people would have forgotten. Most people never carried a mattress through a rainstorm." Emily smiled. "Fair point." Noah suddenly disappeared into his room and returned holding a folded piece of paper. "I made something." He handed it to Alexander. Carefully, Alexander opened the drawing. It was a new version of the picture Noah had created in the warehouse. The same small house stood beneath a bright yellow sun. The same future dog occupied the yard. But now there was one extra figure standing beside the house. Who was that? Alexander asked. Noah looked surprised by the question. You. For a moment, nobody spoke. You helped us get here. Alexander stared at the drawing. Across boardrooms and construction sites, he had received awards, plaques, and recognition worth millions of dollars. Yet nothing had ever felt quite like a crayon drawing from a 6-year-old boy. Emily watched the expression on his face and understood. Some gifts could not be measured. Some victories never appeared in annual reports. As evening sunlight filled the apartment, Noah carefully taped the drawing beside the window. The paper fluttered gently in the warm breeze. A simple house, a bright sun, a future dog. Months earlier, it had been a dream sketched on scrap paper inside a warehouse. Now it was a life beginning to take shape. And Alexander finally understood something that years of success had never taught him. He thought he was building towers that changed cities. But a single mother and her son had reminded him that the most important thing anyone could build was a place where hope could finally come home.